Hopefully, you'll never face execution for committing a horrible crime. But if you do, don't squander the opportunity for a quotable final statement. Sure, you could just tell your parents or spouse that you love them, but you could also be like the following criminals, who said some pretty bizarre and crazy things just before being shuffled off the mortal coil. Here are 25 of the weirdest things anyone said in the face of execution. Most famously portrayed by Charlize Theron in the 2003 film Monster, Aileen Wuornos was executed on October 9, 2002, after killing 6 times over. Her final statement was as incomprehensible as it was memorable. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with The Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." That's certainly an interesting quote, but not a terribly accurate one. For one thing, Independence Day came out on July 2nd, not June 6th. Also, as of this video, she has not in fact been back. And as a side note, I'm guessing Dwayne Johnson heard this quote and immediately requested to be left out of this. Can you blame him? Thomas Grasso committed double murder and on March 20th, 1995 paid the ultimate price for doing so. He had what sounds like a delicious last meal: mussels, clams, a Burger King double cheeseburger, ribs, milkshakes, pumpkin pie, strawberries, and spaghetti. But the menu was apparently unacceptable to him. He used his final moments to let the world know why. According to Grasso, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this. Fresh pasta instead of canned? Talk about cruel and unusual punishment." Wesley Allen Dodd was a monster, but at least he knew he was one. He was convicted of molesting 3 children before brutally murdering them, and he knew he had to go. He requested to be executed, realizing he would rape and murder again if set free and given the chance. To him, the only cure for his condition was to be destroyed. That's why on January 5, 1993, he gave a statement prior to his hanging, saying, "I was once asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way sex offenders could be stopped. I said no, I was wrong." But rather than this being mere dark humor in the face of death, he continued, opining, "I was wrong when I said there was no hope, no peace. There is hope. There is peace. I found both in the Lord Jesus Christ. Look to the Lord and you'll find peace." Perhaps, but the families of his victims likely found peace when Dodd was removed from the world. On September 13, 2000, prolific robber George Harris was executed for the murder of an acquaintance who Harris had entrusted 2 machine guns to. When Harris came back later for the guns, his acquaintance claimed he didn't know where they were. So Harris shot him, proving that his acquaintance was right to keep those machine guns away from him. He clearly wasn't repentant for the killing. When given the chance to speak one last time, he said, "Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney." And that's why the courts decided he had to go. While she most certainly wasn't a criminal, Sarah Good still makes this list for having one of the most memorable facing execution lines in history. As one of the first women to be accused of witchcraft during the 1692 Salem witch trials, Sarah Good was in an impossible position. No matter what she did or said, the courts were going to find her guilty of witchcraft. So she decided to face the inevitable with one of the most quotable lines in condemned person history. Once she was found guilty, she yelled at the presiding judge, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." While it's certainly possible she said other words before actually being hanged, these were her final words recorded for posterity. And as it turns out, her words may have been prophetic after all. 25 years after Sarah Good's trial, her judge actually choked to death on his own blood. It was either pure coincidence or Sarah Good really was a witchy woman. A slow-acting one, but still. Jimmy Glass murdered 2 people following an escape from the jail he was already incarcerated in, so at least he was used to where he was going once arrested. After his trial, he was sentenced to die via the electric chair, something he attempted to circumvent by petitioning the highest court in the land. He argued to the Supreme Court that the chair was cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore unconditional. The court disagreed, and to the chair he went. Resigned to his fate, Glass devoted his final words to more complaining, but this time of a more trivial nature. Strapped into the chair, Glass uttered, "I'd rather be fishing," before getting fried alive. To be fair, most people would probably agree with him. In 1991, Robert Towery robbed and murdered a man, and the next year was sentenced to death. It took 20 years, but on March 8, 2012, Towery finally faced the ultimate punishment. For the most part, his final statement was straightforward. He apologized to the victim's family, his family, and wept over the endless mistakes he made. But then he uttered his official final words, which made hardly any sense at all. "I love my family. Potato, potato, potato." Nobody knows what he meant by potato. It could have been a pet name his family had for him. It could have been a pet name he had for a loved one. Perhaps he simply loved potatoes. Or possibly it was mere delirium from the lethal drugs flowing through his veins. There are few better or braver ways to face pending death than with a terrible pun. That's exactly what convicted cop killer George Apple did just before getting the electric chair on August 29, 1928. When asked if he had a final statement, Apple provided one for the ages. "Well, gentlemen, you're about to see a baked apple." His classic dad joke didn't save him from the mercy seat, but I'd like to think the executioner at least smirked a bit before pulling the fatal lever. Few people are pure, unadulterated 100% evil, but Carl Panzram certainly was. Violent crime was his career, and he happily worked overtime. By his own account, he murdered 31 people and raped both men and boys over 1,000 times. He served 9 separate prison terms until killing an official at the prison he was incarcerated at. After that, he received the death penalty, being hung on September 5, 1930. As befitting a man without a good bone in his body, Panzram spent his final statement heaping abuse on others. Feeling his executioner was taking too long to end him, he spat in his face and yelled, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard! I can hang a dozen men while you're screwing around." Since he didn't exactly endear himself to his jailers, he received the most unceremonious burial possible. He was buried on prison grounds with a headstone that simply reads 31614, his prison number. Peter Kürten was essentially Dracula. Known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, Kürten was found guilty of 9 murders and 31 attempted murders, though he likely committed far more. What's more, he was known to drink some of his victims' blood, which likely figured into the court's decision to kill him via beheading on July 2, 1931. Kürten faced his own death with the same bloodlust he had when forcing others to face theirs. He asked the executioner, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Then when the executioner asked him if he had any real last words, he simply replied no. He knew he couldn't top his query, and so he didn't even try. Much like George Apple, condemned murderer James French faced the electric chair with a smile and a dad joke. On August 10, 1966, just before taking the ultimate punishment for hitchhiking and then killing a man who picked him up, he cracked wise to the executioner, "How's this for a headline? French fries." He was then asked if he had anything else to say, and he responded, "Everything's already been said." He, like others before him, knew that if you gotta go out with a pun for the ages. Vincent Gutierrez endeared himself to nobody when he carjacked an Air Force captain named Jose Cobo and then shot him to death. It wasn't exactly controversial when the court sentenced him to die, an execution that happened on March 28, 2007. Gutierrez, rather than apologize to the family of the man he killed, chose to act like he was in a comedy. When asked if he had any final words, he essentially broke the fourth wall, asking his brother, "Where's my stunt double when you need one?" The state didn't bother looking for his stunt double. They had a cold-blooded murderer to kill off. Back in the day, more crimes were punishable by death than in today's world. For example, an outlaw named Tom Blackjack Ketchum tried to rob a train. He was unsuccessful in doing so, but his audacity to even try, combined with his past record, caused the law to conclude he needed to die. So on April 26, 1901, Ketchum was put to death for his bungled crime. He wasn't terribly repentant based on his final words. Since this happened such a long time ago, it's hard to confirm exactly what he said. But it was either "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys, let her rip," or "Goodbye, please dig my grave very deep. Alright, hurry up." Either way, he was clearly impatient to see what happens after he became an ex-person. James Rogers murdered a miner named Charles Merrifield, and on March 30th, 1960, he paid for that crime with his life. Sentenced to die via firing squad, he was offered a chance at a final statement and request. To that end, he snapped, "I done told you my last request, a bulletproof vest." Shockingly, that request was not granted. His actual final words came shortly thereafter. It was a chilly March day, and Rogers was wearing only denim. His executioners asked him if he wanted a coat, and he refused, quipping, "Don't worry, I'll be where it's warm soon." Most likely he didn't mean Florida. In 1994, Jeffrey Matthews murdered his 77-year-old great-uncle following a burglary attempt. Justice wasn't exactly swift, as he wasn't executed for his crimes until January 11, 2011. On that day, after giving his love to his mother and wishing his death row pals the best, he offered what was either a joke or a last-ditch effort to save his bacon. He exclaimed, "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." It's the same rationale lovesick teenagers use when excusing why their crush hasn't texted them back, with the exact same unhappy result. In 1978, Robert Alton Harris went to San Diego and murdered 2 teen boys. 14 years later, on April 21, 1992, he paid for taking those lives with losing his own. Just prior to death, he devoted his final statement to vague philosophy. As he put it, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." In short, everybody faces the same fate regardless of who they are or what they did in life. Unfortunately for him, not only was this not his line, he got it wrong. He was attempting to quote the Grim Reaper's rap from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. And while he got the basic point right, he mangled the rhythm. The real line was, "You might be a king or a little street sweeper, but sooner or later you'll dance with the Reaper. Even when you're ready to die, you shouldn't mess up the classics." Like with Tom Ketchum earlier, Erskine Childers was executed for a crime that he most certainly wouldn't be killed over today. The Irish nationalist and gun smuggler was caught illegally possessing a firearm, and the government, who clearly didn't like him anyway, used that as an excuse to murder him. So on November 24, 1922, Childers faced a firing squad and lost his life. He was nothing if not helpful in his final moments, directing the squad to "take a step or two forward, lads. It'll be easier that way." Whether they heeded his advice or not, the firing squad clearly did their jobs that day. It was rare for the courts to execute a woman back in the day, but Barbara Graham managed to force their hand. After committing robbery and murder, she was sentenced to die in the San Quentin gas chamber. And on June 3, 1955, that's exactly what happened. She maintained her innocence to the end. Her final words were heavy, to say the least. Good people are always so sure they're right. Hollywood clearly agreed, as Graham's story was later dramatized in the 1958 film I Want to Live, which made a pretty clear, if debatable, argument that Graham was innocent. In 1999, Jeffrey Williams murdered a police officer, an act that wasn't going to win him many fans anywhere, much less within Texas law enforcement. Sure enough, he was convicted and sentenced to die, a sentence carried out on May 15, 2013. Rather than apologize for his crimes or insist on his innocence, Williams spent his final statement ranting. "You clown police," he said. "You gonna stop with all that killing all these kids? You gonna stop killing innocent kids, murdering young kids? When I kill one or pop one, y'all wanna kill me. God has a plan for everything, you hear? I love everyone that loves me. I ain't got no love for anyone that don't love me." In other words, he felt that while he may have murdered, the focus should be on police officers who kill, not him. Clearly the prison didn't agree, as they executed him anyway. Any murder is terrible, but James Lewis Jackson's choice of victims was particularly heinous, as was the way he chose to murder them. Not only did he strangle his wife to death, but his 2 young stepdaughters. For these crimes, he was executed on February 7, 2007. His final words were a mouthful. He started out by commanding the warden to murder me. Yes, not execute him, but murder him. Then he compared the area that convicted him, Harris County, to Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities destroyed by God in the Bible because their citizens wouldn't stop sinning. Finally, he ended his speech with, "I'm ready to roll. Time to get this party started." The warden did just that. George Engel is one of the most notorious anarchists of his time, and perhaps of all time. He and several of his cohorts set off a bomb in Chicago's Haymarket Square that killed 7 people. For that crime, he and his partners were sentenced to hang. On November 11, 1887, Engel and company were led to the gallows. Offered one final chance to speak, Engel simply shouted, "Hurrah for anarchy!" Clearly, he had no desire to apologize for what he did, but at least he got his final statement out. His partner Albert Parsons attempted to speak, but only got so far as, "Will I be allowed to speak, O men of America? Let me speak, Sheriff Matson. Let the voice of the people be heard." Oh, before the executioner got the signal to open the hatch and send the condemned to their doom. Patrick Brian Knight kidnapped a couple and locked them in his basement. Later, he took them to an isolated area and shot them to death. He most certainly did not get away with this, as he was arrested, tried, convicted, and then sentenced to die. His death date came on June 26, 2007. Apparently, he promised a joke or two in his final statement, because he delivered just that. Kind of. Not all of us are innocent, but those victims of his are. I said I was going to tell a joke. Death has set me free. That's the biggest joke. I deserve this. His follow-up joke showed that while he may have known he was guilty, he wasn't planning on going out weeping. The other joke is that I am not Patrick Brian Knight, and y'all can stop this execution now. Go ahead, I'm finished. Considering the warden didn't even begin to consider stopping the execution, he probably didn't believe a word Knight said. Andrei Chikatilo was an especially brutal serial killer out of Soviet Russia. Once caught, he confessed to the murders of over 50 people, virtually all women and children, between 1978 and 1990. Finally, on February 14, 1994, Russia executed him with a single gunshot to the head. Say what you will about Soviet Russia, but they were certainly efficient. Chikatilo responded to his Valentine's Day execution with final words straight out of a comedy. First, he pleaded, "Don't blow my brains out." But then came the twist. Rather than not wanting to die, he explained he needed his brains intact because the Japanese want to buy them. Sadly, for whatever Japanese buyer was interested in serial killer brains, the executioner did in fact blow them out. Gary Burris robbed and murdered a taxi driver in Indianapolis in 1980. He got death for this crime, and his time was up on November 20th, 1997. Offered the usual chance at a final statement, he chose to reference pop culture and quote a memorable line from Star Trek. But unlike Robert Alton Harris from earlier, Burris at least nailed his quote of choice. "Beam me up." While that's certainly a memorable final thing to say, probably not very many Trekkies fondly recall it or him at the conventions. In 1751, Mary Blandy poisoned her father because he disapproved of the man she was engaged to marry. Blandy claimed that she thought the poison wasn't poison, but rather a magical potion that would help change her father's mind, but clearly the courts didn't buy that. Instead, they decided she had to die, and so she was hung the very next year. Despite being a murderer, Mary Blandy insisted on remaining a lady until the very end. Her final words to those about to hang her were, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, do not hang me high." Her concern wasn't so much that she was about to lose her life after taking that of her own father's, but rather that after her death, men might be able to look up her dress.